Every day, terrorism strikes individuals, families, and entire communities. It affects all of us, impacting communities here in Colorado and around the world. The Cell is answering this call to action. The Cell is dedicated to preventing terrorism and enhancing safety through our nationally recognized training initiatives, renowned events, and world-class exhibit. Our Community Awareness Program, CAP, provides citizens with the tools to help prevent terrorist activity. The CAP was built upon the Cell's award-winning video, recognizing 8 signs of terrorism, and was developed in partnership with our public safety community. Today, thousands of individuals have been trained to help protect themselves, their loved ones, and their neighborhoods. The Cell hosts events that address the most salient topics in counterterrorism and national security. They provide the community critical forums in which to interact with leading experts in the field. These programs have engaged nearly 50,000 people. The only one of its kind, the Cell Exhibit and Training Center is a dynamic, interactive experience developed by world-renowned experts and award-winning artists. It addresses the most current issues facing global security. Visit today and learn how you can help prevent terrorism and enhance our community's safety.
And now, please welcome Larry A. Meisel and Melanie Perlman, founder and executive director of The Cell.
Good evening, everybody. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's forum. We have the honor to hear from 2 leading national security experts who have firsthand knowledge of U.S. counterterrorism abroad and all that it entails. From the upheaval in Iraq and Syria to the evolving nature of Al-Qaeda to U.S. prisoner exchange policy, tonight's program is incredibly timely. By continually hosting programs like these, the Cell is at the forefront of educating the community on the most salient issues impacting our national security. This fall marks the 13th anniversary of the horrific attacks of 9/11. The Cell, in conjunction with the Denver Post, the Governor's Office, and the Mayor's Office, would like to invite you to our yearly event, Colorado Remembers 9/11. This year, we are pleased to announce that our speaker will be General David Petraeus, and we hope that you'll be able to attend. You should all have a save the date in front of you, and tickets will be on sale soon. I wanted to extend a special thank you to the Denver Post for their premier sponsorship of all Cell's events, especially Dean Singleton, who's chairman and publisher, who is here with us tonight. So thank you, Dean. I also wanted to thank Fastlane for all the excellent technical expertise and equipment that was provided tonight and being our continued AV partner. Thanks, Fastlane. And thank you to the History Colorado Center for partnering with us this evening. I saw the executive director. He actually delayed his trip, Ed Nichols, who's over there. Ed, thanks so much for staying, and thanks so much for your partnership. It takes a village. I also want to extend a special thank you to my tremendous staff, the Cell's staff, and all of the volunteers who have really helped make this evening happen. So thank you, and now please welcome Larry A. Meisel, founder of The Cell.
Thank you, Melanie. As always, it's wonderful to be in front of you as part of our community that chooses to be aware of what's around us, what's happening to our city, our state, our country, and the world. We were commenting just before we started how timely it was today as a subject matter, and I think how timely it seems to be every day that terrorism is upon us in our lives throughout the world. And we're very fortunate that we're able to put on informational opportunities and to have such a distinguished panel here this evening to inform us and educate us to some of the issues that we are living in. Our first panelist is Michael B. Mukasey. The judge has served as the 81st United States Attorney General under President George W. Bush. As Attorney General, he oversaw the Justice Department and advised on critical issues, domestic and international law. Prior to serving for 18 years, he was the U.S. District Court Judge for the Southern District of New York. That's a nice, easy place to be, you know? He served Chief Judge from 2000 to 2006. During his tenure on the bench, he handled numerous high-profile cases, including the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. We forget that was the prelude to 2001. Our second panelist is the Honorable Juan Carlos Zarate. Zarate served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism from 2005 until 2009 under President George W. Bush. In this capacity, he was responsible for developing and implementing the U.S. government's counterintelligence strategy. He served as the first Assistant Secretary to the Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crimes. In this capacity, he led domestic and international efforts to attack terrorism financing and led the global hunt for Saddam Hussein. He currently serves as advisor as a national security analyst in CBS News and is a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Moderating this evening, our panel will be the award-winning foreign correspondent and journalist Greg Dobbs, one of our own Colorado persons. As a foreign correspondent for ABC News, Mr. Dobbs covered world events from the Iranian revolutions and the hostage crisis to the Iran-Iraq war and the civil war that took place in Lebanon. Mr. Dobbs is the recipient of 2 National Emmy Awards, as well as the Distinguished Service Award from the Society of Professional Journalists. I want to thank all of you again for being here, and I turn the event over to Mr. Dobbs.
Larry, thank you, and thanks to all of you for being interested in learning more about terrorism. Not everybody raises their hand if you ask, would you like to spend an evening learning about how much danger we're really in? Let's begin with this. We all know what terrorism is. Whether we're Republicans or Democrats, whether we're men or women, black or white, tall or short, young or old, American citizens or not, everyone in this room, most everyone in this nation knows what terrorism is. But that doesn't mean that most of us could necessarily define it. In fact, there are several federal law enforcement agencies, believe it or not, that have slightly, if not more than slightly different definitions of terrorism. And you can look at the Cell's own website, thecell.org. Take a look when you go home. You will see that there is no single universally used definition of the word terrorism. So I'd like to give you my own. And you might quibble a little bit with the wording, but if the 2 panelists choose to quibble, we turn off their microphones. It doesn't matter what the motive. Terrorism is executed for religious reasons, for political, economic, ideological, sometimes even pathological purposes. But we know it when we see it. So my definition is this. And it comes pretty close to the others you'll find if you look it up. Terrorism is an act of violence that deliberately targets, or at the very least, disregards the safety of non-combatants, of civilians, of innocents, you and me. Counterterrorism is different in one big respect. We don't necessarily even know it when we see it. The definition of counterterrorism is pretty simple. It is measures to combat terrorism. But how often is counterterrorism exercised in ways that we don't even see on our radar? The answer is quite a lot. So how much do you in this room really understand about not just where the threats come from, and in this fast-changing world, how the priorities when it comes to counterterrorism might be shifting? But what do you know about the tools that the United States of America has at its disposal to protect us? What do you know about how efficient they are? What do you know about those things that are, in fact, nipped in the bud, but we never hear about it? So that's part of what we'll talk about this evening. As a journalist, as you heard, I've covered stories about terrorism, and I've covered actual acts of terrorism all over the world, and particularly in the wide swath of the Islamic world, and that should come as no surprise. And as you also heard, we have two men sitting here who have, in effect, had their own boots on the ground in the battle to combat terrorism. The only bad news, and I want to warn you, and this is a reminder to the panelists, is that both Judge Mukasey and Juan Zarate, they could probably take an hour and a quarter to answer each question I ask, but we only have an hour and a quarter all told, so we have to keep the answers short because there are a lot of questions to ask. The first are just for the sake of public education, very general, the sort of Cliff's Notes version of counterterrorism. What is it? What tools does the U.S. have in its arsenal, both civil and military, and how effective are they?
Judge, start. Okay. Mercifully, we have quite a lot of tools in our bag, civil and military. We have an entire system developed at the Treasury Department for monitoring the flow of money, which of course is that without which terrorism, or a lot of terrorism, couldn't exist. And so if you cut off the money, you've cut off a lot of the resources, or interrupted the flow of the money. But we can't interrupt all the money because a lot of it comes locally, particularly in the Middle East. And so we use electronic surveillance, which has been effective, or at least has been effective until Edward Snowden decided to pull the cork and do an amazing amount of damage that I don't think has been calculated yet and hasn't become clear yet. That is, hasn't become fully clear yet, but is something that I think is going to haunt us for a long time. And we have partners overseas who, notwithstanding the occasional hostility and friction that prevails at the higher levels of government, between governments, at the operational level, I think we cooperate very well certainly with the Europeans, with the Israelis, and with many others in the Middle East, to take measures, concrete measures, to combat plots and nip them in the bud, confuse them, deny them resources, and when necessary, take people out.
I think the judge is absolutely right. I think one way of thinking about the counterterrorism landscape is to think about offensive and defensive measures. You have offensive measures that can take terrorists out. You can arrest individuals, targeted killings in particular cases. Then there are the defensive measures, the things that are intended to deter or to get in the way of terrorist plotting, the things like airport security, things that get in our way, things that may not be wholly seen. And then the long pole in the tent, as the judge was alluding to, is really the intelligence picture. The intelligence picture allows you to understand the threat landscape. Who are the actors? What are their capabilities? What are they intending? What can you do with that information then to disrupt? And then also to target your defensive measures. Who on the plane shouldn't be on the plane? Who is moving cash? Who shouldn't be moving cash? And so in many ways, thinking about the landscape through offensive and defensive measures, and then the intelligence picture with, as the judge mentioned, an international environment that is really built around sharing information and trying to take action collectively. And I think that's one way of thinking about the environment.
Let me, in an effort to keep this discussion as unstructured as possible, talk about intelligence measures. Judge, you said, and I'm not sure I'm quoting you exactly, that because of Snowden, many of our electronic intel measures have been virtually destroyed. It's hard to believe we're sitting here naked.
No, we're not sitting here naked, but understand that there are two programs, the existence of which he disclosed, that are a lot less effective now than they were before he disclosed them. One is what was called the metadata program, involving the gathering of metadata, that is the information about telephone calls that are made both internationally and domestically, but not the content of the calls, only the calling number, the called number, the duration, and the date. How is that useful? Well, if we get a hit on a foreign number that we know is associated with a terrorist or with a safe house, we can run through the entire database, or we could before it got out, run through the entire database of telephone calls, find out whether that number had either called or been called by a number in the United States, so that we had eyes out on the world. Unless we get lucky, there are very few programs that give us eyes out from this country to the rest of the world. The other program, of course, involved conducting electronic surveillance overseas of foreigners, not of U.S. citizens who are protected regardless of where they are, but surveillance of foreigners who are not protected by our Constitution, with whom we have no contract, no agreement, and who conduct surveillance in this country themselves through their governments. That's the way countries deal with one another, like it or not. And of course, that program was disclosed and is less effective for that.
I'd like to comment on this, because regardless of how you feel about Edward Snowden and the recognition that we do have to have a privacy and civil liberties debate around the collection, surveillance, and any counterterrorism tool, the reality is that he has done enormous damage, and you just need to look at it objectively. Counterterrorism officials have spoken openly about the fact that terrorist groups are now not using some of the same means that they were using before to communicate. And so we've gone dark on the way that some of the groups, especially the metastasized universe of al-Qaeda affiliates, have had begun to communicate with each other. And so we've lost some of that picture. So that's one. Two, it's created enormous diplomatic tension. You see the tension between the US and Germany at a pretty critical time when you're talking about threats from Russia and other challenges around the world. You see and know that countries like China and Russia are reverse engineering, right? They now have blueprints as to what the NSA was capable of, and they're not going to foment an internal debate on privacy and civil liberties in Beijing and Moscow. They're going to reverse engineer so that they can do it and begin to use these tools against us and against others, against dissidents. Our private sector is now disadvantaged, and so you now have Cisco and the technology companies from the United States at a disadvantage abroad, because the sense is that they've now sort of colluded with the U.S. government and are tainted. And the final thing I would say is he's distorted, and that whole episode has distorted the current debate. Because we're at a point in our history where we actually have to have more cooperation between the private sector and the public sector, especially on cybersecurity. And that expertise and that integration comes from that collaboration. There's now a chilling effect between those sectors, and he's done real damage to the ability of the U.S. government to think more creatively about what that cooperation looks like. And so regardless of how you feel about him, whether or not you want to label him a traitor or a patriot or accept the debate that's emerged, he's done real damage.
Okay, but let me be a devil's advocate here, and please don't run me out of the room for the spirit of the question.
We might turn your mic off.
I already paid off the electronics expert here. This nation always swings on a pendulum, and that's true when it comes to the issues you're talking about right now. There's probably somebody in this room, if not a lot of people in this room, who are thinking, you know what, some of those electronic intelligence practices were egregious. And maybe the best example is something you raised, listening in on the phone calls of the Chancellor of Germany. I mean, was there some benefit to the exposure? Any benefit in your eyes to the exposure?
The exposure of that?
Of that, for example.
No. Number one, the French listened in a whole lot more than we did. Number two, on her cell phone.
Yeah.
Number two, what the heck is the Chancellor of Germany talking on a publicly accessible cell phone? And number three, and I think most important, at a time when, for example, we'd like to know what the German government's policy is on everything from supporting the euro to cracking down on German companies that have relationships with the Iranians that they shouldn't have. All of that is in our national interest to know. There's nothing wrong with our trying to know it.
Okay, to something else you said about funding for terrorist groups. And we're talking about ISIS, amongst other things, right now. You know, it's rather telling. It's rather telling. The title of this forum, it's not up on the wall, but I have it written down here somewhere. The title of this forum is U.S. Counterterrorism Abroad, Iraq, Al-Qaeda, and Prisoner Exchange, which means Sergeant Bowie Bergdahl, the American soldier who was a prisoner of the Taliban for several years and then exchanged for 5 former Taliban leaders from Guantanamo. And it's a rhetorical question, but it's got to be on the minds of people here as well. You know, the title of this forum wasn't conceived all that long ago, but ISIS is not in there. Does this indicate the speed with which counterintelligence experts have to move, have to think? I mean, suddenly this group comes, it didn't come out of nowhere, and you guys know that, and I know that, but you know, we never heard of it before. Now it's the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and they are establishing what we're clearly going to see as a haven for terrorism, and it isn't even in the title. What does that say about the speed with which priorities have to shift?
Well, I think environments grow complicated, and by having Iraq in the title, I think you capture all sorts of problems in that environment, not just ISIS, but the growth of other militia groups and other fractures in that environment, which create opportunities for terrorist groups like ISIS. I refuse to call it the Islamic State. That's what they call themselves, but I'll call it ISIS. The reality, though, is, and there's frankly nobody better to draw the historical lineage back than Judge Mukasey, and it's such an honor to be up here with the judge. He's a legendary figure, and for those of you who don't know him...
That translates as old.
No. Give me this prerogative. The one regret I had in government was not watching Judge Mukasey serve longer as our Attorney General. He's a man of great integrity and great intellect. But in any event, if you draw the lineage back, you can see... You can see and understand what these groups have wanted. Al-Qaeda has wanted, the battle, the ideological battle from Al-Qaeda has been the establishment of a doctrine to say we need to establish a caliphate, a physical territory that draws back to the historical roots of Islam. And what we need to do to establish that is not to attack the near enemy, the autocratic regimes in Egypt or in Libya or the rest. What we need to do, and this was bin Laden and Zawahiri's innovation, we need to attack the head of the snake, the United States. They're behind all of this. If you exit the United States from the region, you can run rampant and rule the region. And so that's been Al-Qaeda's agenda, its mantra. It's now the global jihadi DNA that's embedded throughout. And ISIS is nothing more than Al-Qaeda in Iraq that's been rejuvenated. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which we fought and battled directly, our men and women in uniform, directly in Fallujah and other places. They were suppressed. They resurrected themselves both in western Iraq and in Syria. They used the cauldron of conflict, foreign recruits, money, control of resources like oil installations and bakeries and food storehouses. And they've rejuvenated themselves. And they've controlled territory. And the fact that they now control wide swaths of Iraq and Syria have literally erased the borders between Syria and Iraq, literally destroyed the boundaries and the posts, is a demonstration that these people mean business, that the wild imaginings of the caliphate that many folks and observers would often poo-poo or laugh off really animate the way these people think. And if you don't think it's a serious threat, you just need to look at the Middle East today, because these people believe in their agenda, they're committed to it, and it's not just local. For them, it's now global.
In the context of a quote from one of the spokesmen of Al-Qaeda, ISIS is too extreme for us. Now, I don't know if that was actually said or translated accurately, but would you put ISIS, if you have to prioritize, would you put it at the top of the list of threats?
No, ISIS reminds me of a man on a bicycle.
Be careful because I ride a bicycle.
Well, then you know very well that you got to keep moving or else you fall off. And ISIS has been that kind of phenomenon. I think, in a way, it's likely to prove, in my view, a flash in the pan. But the larger pan, I think, is what's important. Interestingly, you know, that terrorism has a substantial connection to Colorado because a lot of it got started when a man named Syed Qutb came after this really goes back to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire.
You were just a young boy at the time.
Right. I mean, I was almost hurt by the collapse of the there was a man named Hassan al-Banna who felt that was a tragedy. In fact, the drawing of Juan mentioned the erasing of the lines. Those lines were drawn by a French diplomat and a British diplomat in what was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement back in 1916. And that's been a thorn in the side of Islamists ever since, because they sat down and created this secret agreement to draw the lines of what we now regard as Middle Eastern countries that didn't exist at the time, that were really part of the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, there was this fellow Hassan al-Banna, who was an Egyptian, and a disciple of his named Syed Qutb became very agitated about what was happening, about the westernizing influence. And Qutb, in fact, raised so much hell in Egypt that he got a traveling fellowship. Regrettably, he came to the United States. And in fact, he came to Greeley, Colorado, where he was so mortified by American life and by things like jazz music and crew cuts and men and women sitting together in church. I thought this was the most decadent society he'd ever seen. He became convinced that they had to fight Western civilization. Went back, raised some more hell in Egypt, was hanged by Nasser, and then all the Islamists scattered. Many of them went to Saudi Arabia. In fact, his brother, Qutb's brother, went to Saudi Arabia to teach the doctrine and taught it to Ayman al-Zawahiri and to the pampered son of a very wealthy construction family named Osama bin Laden, and that's kind of how it all got started. It's a product of Greeley, Colorado. Go figure.
Thanks a lot.
Blame it on Colorado.
Right.
Well, you know, you used the word decadence, Michael. I covered, as you heard from Larry Meisel, I covered the revolution in Iran. For about 2 years, I spent most of my life in Iran. And there were several reasons why my perception is, and that of all journalists on the street at the time, the majority of people in Iran, and we're going back, what are we talking, 35 years, wanted to get rid of the Shah. He was not a good guy. He was our bad guy, but he was a bad guy to many Iranians. And part of it is that he wanted to westernize the nation. He saw the benefits of being on our side instead of the other side. But to them, the word westernization equated with decadence. I mean, frankly, I watch people like Lindsay Lohan, and sometimes I understand it. But they saw it as decadence. We didn't necessarily understand that. I have long believed, now I want your thoughts on this, please, that one of the major flaws in American foreign policy, and this is in the context of counterterrorism, is that we don't even try sometimes to understand how the other guy thinks. I interviewed Colonel Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, many times, and on one of these occasions it followed a terrorist attack in 2 European airports, in both cases on lines of people who were waiting to check in for flights on US airlines. And they shot up people in both airports, both cities. And we happened to, for ABC News, we chartered quickly down to Tripoli, and I got an interview with Gaddafi, on a tractor, by the way. We were taken out to a field, and he was driving a tractor, and when I asked him, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm tilling the fields for the people." And I said, "Do you do this a lot?" He says, "All the time, I till the fields for the people." When I finally asked him to turn the tractor off so we could actually do the interview with a television camera, for his life, he couldn't find the key. But
farmer.
The farmer's Gaddafi. But I then asked him, directly, because Ronald Reagan was the president, and he pointed a finger at Libya as the responsible party hosting the terrorists who had shot up these European airports. And I asked, "Did you harbor the terrorists who did this?" And his answer, and I'm giving it to you almost verbatim, he spoke pretty good English, was, "We do not support terrorism." And then he paused. And I was about to open my big fat mouth to fill the silence when fortunately he opened his first and said, but we do support freedom fighters. Now you see the point. They don't define things the way we do. They don't think the way we do. They don't want the same things we do. They don't see life on Earth the way we see life on Earth. So in the context of counterterrorism, at the end of the world's longest question, do you agree that that's a major flaw and that we fail sometimes, and some of our failures are a result of this failure to think the way the bad guys think?
I think actually we've gotten very good at understanding the way the bad guys think. Do we have faults at times when we don't take local culture and context into account properly or aggressively enough? I think you could say that happened in Iraq early on after the invasion. Not enough of an appreciation for some of the Sunni-Shia fights and divides that would happen, what would happen after the de-Baathification process. So absolutely, I think there are times when we don't understand local context well enough. But if you talk about sort of the Al-Qaeda-led Sunni extremist movement, I think we've learned their playbook rather well, and we understand and we've read their strategies and their motivations. They've said very clearly, they love death more than we love life, right? And they've got a very clear political strategy and agenda, and I think we often forget that to our peril, but there is an ideological undercurrent to much of this.
But if I may interrupt, you just said we often forget that to our peril.
Well, I think we as a public.
What can we do about that?
I think we as a public. I think we have to understand the historical context in which we're operating. I think we obviously have to work very closely with local partners. And I think part of the success of counterterrorism policy over the past decade or so is the fact that we have leveraged local partners much more aggressively, much more innovatively. And in fact, if you listen to President Obama's speech at West Point, where he laid out sort of his vision for a future counterterrorism strategy, it's very much built on this premise, this idea that we have to have, in a sense, regional approaches and empowerment of local partners to actually cut off, suppress, and deal with the terrorism that is taking root in places like North Africa or West Africa or Central Asia. And that, I think, becomes important for us to understand the landscape. And I think you've seen that over time with our intelligence community and our military trying to do that much better.
Empowerment of local partners. Judge Mukasey made reference in his very first remarks to funding for ISIS and probably for other, particularly Sunni groups. And we know full well, yeah, some of the money evidently they got from a bank in Mosul in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But a lot of it, we all know, and there's no denying, they get from some of our partners, particularly in the oil-rich Gulf, who talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk in their partnership with the United States. They play both ends against the middle, and they have for a long time.
Well, look, the Saudis have been doing this for a long time.
Yeah.
And they apply the wisdom that was once taught by Lyndon Johnson, who said of a political opponent, I'd rather have him inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. And that's
I can't
the way
believe Johnson spoke that way.
Right. And so they will finance activities that are directed at other people so that they don't get directed at them. And that's been going on for a long time. Same with the Qataris.
I think the challenge you have now, especially with ISIS and with the current environment, is that funding is now local and global, right? So you still have those global networks that had been suppressed, that had been deterred or disrupted, resurrecting themselves in the context of Syria. A lot of these groups that are fighting, that are Al-Qaeda related or ISIS related, are also baking bread and mending wounds, right? And so they're appealing to the charitable instincts in places like Qatar and Kuwait, where the U.S. Treasury has called out those countries in particular for supporting some of these groups. And so you've got that. But you also then have a local model where ISIS, and this is what makes them interesting and unique in this context, they've run a war economy. They have figured out how to control economies that they physically operate in. And so they've levied taxes and extortion. They run the food markets. They rob the banks, but then they run the banks. Mm-hmm. They run oil refineries. They even trade, believe it or not, with the Assad regime. They take oil from their sector and charge for the security to ship it to the border post, and then they sell it to the Syrian government. And so this is a very sophisticated group that's learned over time that in order to survive, as Judge Mukasey said, to stay on the bike, you've got to be able to run an economy. You've got to be able to fund yourself and also take from what comes abroad.
Okay, well, there are at least two stages in the process of counterterrorism. One is understanding the problem, and you just articulated it. The second one is doing something about it, suppressing it. What can we do about those things, including, by the way, the funding of their operations by people who purport to be our friends?
I think we have to make it clear to our friends that we're not going to suffer it, and we have to be in a position not to suffer it. I think a large part of the energy revolution in this country makes it possible for us to be in a position not to suffer it quite as much as we did before. The discovery of vast gas reserves, the fracking are techniques and developments that are going to allow us to achieve a greater level of independence from that part of the world than we had before, and as a result to resist. But the fact is we have to stay alert to a couple of things. Number one, this is a religious and ideological movement, religiously and ideologically inspired. And we've said, well, these are extremists. They are, in point of fact, pretty mainstream when it comes to the teaching of their religion. And for us to tell them that we know their religion better than they do is presumptuous in the highest order. We're going to have to resist for a long time. And in order to do that, we have to have faith and confidence in our own institutions, which lately has become a bit of a problem.
In that context, maybe 3 years ago, I shot a documentary in Colombia about the drug war. And the head of the U.S. counter-narcotic operations for all of Latin America is based at our embassy in Bogota. And he said to me, you know, we stay just this much ahead of the bad guys who are trying to get drugs into our country. Is there a parallel? Do we stay just this much ahead of the bad guys who are trying to terrorize us and our allies?
Yeah, I think in large part it's self-inflicted. The fellow who tried to explode a bomb in Times Square, Faisal Shahzad. Interestingly, the continuation of that story, if you turn from the front page of account of that story in the New York Times to the inside, you found that he got his money from Pakistan by courier. And you said, wait a second, this is the 21st century. What's he doing getting money by courier? Well, the New York Times, back in the day, decided that a program that the United States used to track terrorist financing through the SWIFT system, which was not unlawful, it was perfectly lawful, was just too good a story to pass up. And so they put it in the paper, as a result of which terrorists started not using the SWIFT system, and Faisal Shahzad got his money by courier. So a lot of this, I think, is self-inflicted and results from an inability of people to restrain themselves in what they talk about and what they account and what they describe.
You might have seen me looking at my watch. Believe me, it's not out of boredom, you know, like, is it still this time? It's just because we've used up most of the time already. So I'm going to move along to the subject of the prisoner exchange of the 31st of May, 6 weeks or so ago. And Judge, you wrote something calling it a ghastly transaction. There's more than one school of thought. That's yours. Explain that.
He took 5 senior leaders of the Taliban. These are not, there are 2 kinds of prisoners at Guantanamo. There are Al-Qaeda people and there are Taliban people. He took the 5 most valuable Taliban leaders they had at Guantanamo and released them for this guy. They are going to be back, sure as God made little green apples. And they were sent to Qatar for a year. I got when I was Attorney General, I received a hand-delivered letter from the Attorney General of Qatar asking me in my capacity as Attorney General to release the blind sheikh who was the head of the 93 plot to blow up the Trade Center, who I had put in jail for life as a district judge, asked me as the Attorney General to release them to the custody of the Qataris. So those people carry water for a whole lot of bad folks. The idea that they are even going to be restrained for a year strains credulity, and after a year, it's Katie bar the door. I think it was a terrible transaction, and the principal goal, I think, was to advance the goal of emptying Guantanamo, which I don't see any reason for, frankly.
Let me put the devil's advocate's view this way to you. Millions, I mean, I've seen it firsthand all over the Islamic world, maybe tens, hundreds of millions perhaps, of people hate us and would like to do us in. Most of them don't have the means, but they all support. They provide safe houses, they provide moral support, different kinds of support for the bad guys who have the means to do us in, or try anyway. It only took 19 on 4 airplanes with maybe that much human support behind them to create 9/11. So arguably, what's it matter if 5 more guys join the crowd? Even if they are former senior leaders of the Taliban, it's just 5 more in a crowd of many millions.
No, these are not foot soldiers. 9/11 was planned by one man, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
Right.
We released 5 of those people, 5 people with rich imaginations, in return for a guy who ran away from his unit. I can't see it.
Let me provide a slightly different view, because I think it was a hard decision. I agree with the judge at the end of the day, probably wasn't the right decision. But I think it was a hard decision. When faced with the opportunity to bring the sole remaining U.S. serviceman who's being held in Afghanistan home, that's a tough decision. But I think context matters here, and consequences and risks matter as well. And I think the point that this was done at a time when we had just announced our exit strategy in Afghanistan, when it was clear that part of the motivation is to clear the decks in Guantanamo of hard cases, because these are 5 individuals, by the way, who are not going to be tried either in a military tribunal or even a civilian or criminal court, Article 3 court. And so the context matters here, and it matters with the transition for Afghanistan. Keep in mind, Afghanistan is going through its first real transition of democratic authority in its modern history. And at that time, without consultation with the Afghan government, we've given up 5 prize elements of the enemy force. And so what message does that send to the Afghans themselves and to the Afghan government? The final thing I would say, and this is partly from my portfolio when I was at the White House, our hostage policy is not to provide concessions to hostage takers. It's not that we don't talk to terrorists. That's often sort of misperceived as our policy. We can talk to anybody. The question is, do we offer concessions for those who have taken American citizens or soldiers hostage? Our policy is that we do not.
But the argument was that it was in the interest of a sacred principle of leaving no man behind.
Right, but there is also a sacred principle of not offering concessions so that you don't raise the price on the heads of any American abroad. So there's a real cost and consequence to that balance, and that's why I started with, this is a tough call, no question. But you have to recognize that there are consequences and risks. And I think as well, the way that the administration rolled it out, sort of in a hurrah moment, didn't reflect some of the very hard realities and consequences and risks. I'll give you one example, dating back to your Columbia reporting days. When we were working in government, we saw the rescue of 3 Americans who'd been held in the jungle of Colombia for 5 years by the FARC. They were there with the highly held political prisoners, including Ingrid Betancourt, who had been a presidential candidate in Colombia. The Colombians did a masterful job of faking out the FARC and getting them to hand over, without a shot being fired, these principal hostages, including the Americans. So after 5 years, they were freed. They were brought back, and the instinct from the White House, because we did not want to raise the value of hostages around the world, and we didn't want to raise the publicity around it, was to say nothing. And if you recall, if you go back, and the reporters in the room and others can look back, was there ever a statement from the White House? Was there a Rose Garden ceremony? No. Why? Because President Bush said, first and foremost, the Colombians need to take credit for this incredible operation. Second of all, the 3 need to reintegrate comfortably and carefully with their families. They've been gone in the triple canopy jungle for 5 years, and we can do this quietly. So we'll bring them to the Oval Office when they're ready. And we did. We brought them quietly in. They met with the president. We took them out. And when I took them out, I escorted them out. To a man said, "We cannot believe we're here just a couple of months after having been in the jungles of Colombia, that we're sitting here in Washington in the White House." But not a word was said, because we didn't want to raise the value of the prisoners or others in the field. And we believed, at least at the moment, that the policy of no concessions was an important one to keep.
Let me double back to a few other references, because I want to try to cover as much as possible in the little time remaining. Guantanamo. And there are you said, Judge, that it might have been an effort in releasing the 5 to begin emptying Guantanamo even further. There are those who argue that Guantanamo is our single best counterterrorism tool because it keeps some of the worst threats, some of the worst human threats bottled up. And others who argue it's the worst thing going because it encourages recruitment to the ranks of terrorists. Which one?
There are two things. There are two things that recruit terrorists. One is success. 9/11 was a great recruiting tool. There have been other great recruiting tools, including look at ISIS. ISIS has been gathering force as it succeeds. That's one recruiting tool, and another is the ideology. Guantanamo is not a recruiting tool, not a substantial recruiting tool, and certainly not a recruiting tool that is as valuable as it is to us as a place to detain people that is remote, secure, and humane. I've been there.
It may be all those things, but insofar as being a recruiting tool, I covered the Troubles in Northern Ireland back in the late 70s, early 80s, and there was a British prison called Long Kesh. That's the prison part, Long Kesh. And that became a recruiting tool for the IRA because their members were imprisoned there. They went on hunger strikes. They wiped their feces on the walls. It was disgusting. People were disgusted on their behalf, and they became more sympathetic. Catholics in Northern Ireland became more sympathetic toward the militant group. People who otherwise would not have supported militants.
And if it hadn't been for Long Kesh, they'd have come up with something else.
The thing I would say is Guantanamo is a symptom of a broader problem, which is how do you hold individuals long-term who remain committed to being at war with the United States, especially when you're not going to be able to put them on trial, right? Those are the hard cases in Guantanamo. And that's the case of the 5 Taliban, right? These are individuals who are still committed to the fight. And so the real question and legal conundrum is, what do you do with these individuals long term? And I think that the greater damage has much less to do with recruiting, and over time, it's less and less. And in part, you look at the propaganda of Al-Qaeda and others, they will use each and every excuse and episode to their advantage. And so it doesn't matter if we're doing something good or bad, right? We're damned if we do, damned if we don't, and they'll use it for recruitment purposes. But the reality is Guantanamo has affected the degree to which some foreign governments are willing to cooperate with us. That's where I see the real...
in that sense, it's done us damage.
That's where there's damage. And I do think the fundamental problem, though, is not about Guantanamo, because we have prison facilities in Afghanistan as well. You know, we keep now suspects that we've arrested on warships as we interrogate them, right? So the concept of holding individuals is not an issue. The question is long term. What do you do with these individuals who remain committed to the fight, and we don't have a way of holding them accountable in our current system? What does that look like? And unfortunately, you know, we haven't figured that out. The last thing I would say is, if you look at the history of the terrorist leaders, the short bench of really important strategic individuals, to include Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who now leads ISIS, a lot of these individuals were in custody at a certain time. The U.S. had Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in custody in Iraq. The Jordanians had Zarqawi, who once led al-Qaeda in Iraq, in custody. A lot of the individuals, to include Abu Yahya al-Libi, one of the great al-Qaeda leaders in recent times, was in U.S. custody. And so there is a real fundamental question here if we're dealing with a long-term war or a long-term threat. You don't have to call it a war. And these individuals are committed to it.
It's a war.
I agree, but there are others who don't want to call it that. That's fine. But the reality still remains. What do you do with these individuals who remain committed to killing as many Americans as possible, to organizing like-minded individuals, and to returning to the battlefield? In the Bush administration, we returned over 530 individuals from Guantanamo. So it wasn't as if we had some fundamental problem getting rid of people. We didn't want to be the world's jailers. The problem is, what do you do with these dangerous folks? And the closer you get to that core group of people, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's in Guantanamo, the more likely it is that you're not going to release them. And so what do you do? And there's no good answer for that.
There's an expression, the more things change, the more they stay the same. You look at Afghanistan, look at ISIS, which it's been like a brush fire across Syria and Iraq, and who knows what's next. Do you see the future in Afghanistan when you look at ISIS in Iraq and Syria? Once the United States reduces
I think,
down to almost zero.
I think the lesson of Iraq in particular, and the absence of a real policy in Syria, is left to its own devices, these terrorist movements and cells metastasize. And that the wishful sort of strategy of trying to contain post facto is really a prescription for disaster, because you're going to end up with situations like you're seeing now, with momentum behind a group flying under a new black banner that is drawing recruits from around the world, drawing funding from around the world, and controlling a vast swath of the Middle East. And I think without U.S. support, or at least political capital and diplomatic muscle, it's not that we have to fight everywhere around the world, but we do have to demonstrate resolve, and we do have to animate our allies to fight. Absent that, you run the risk that you're going to have the Taliban in Afghanistan, or Al-Qaeda again in Afghanistan, establishing safe haven. We now have safe haven in Iraq. We may see that again in Afghanistan.
And you've also got several thousand, at this point, recruits to ISIS who carry either European or American passports. Mm-hmm. Those people are then going to go back where they came from and apply the lessons they learned, and that makes it enormously more dangerous.
To what degree do we and are we able to track them? It's kind of like the guys who went to Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab, which is the terrorist group mainly in Somalia. They've operated elsewhere in East Africa.
This problem makes the Al-Shabaab problem look like child's play.
Right, but I'm asking, what do we do about Westerners, including Americans, who've gone over to the other side and then have legitimate American passports to come home and maybe bring their terror with them?
Well, you have to have intelligence on the front end. Who's radicalizing? State and local fusion centers help with this. You've got to track them as they head out, maybe arrest them before they go. The problem, though, is as they go to the Middle East, they're using Turkey as a throughfare. And Turkey is a completely legitimate and beautiful country in which to travel. I love it, right? You love it. The problem is, how do you track people who say they're going to Turkey but end up going across the border and then coming out? And that's the real challenge. And this is why you've heard the fears, in particular from European counterterrorism officials, who are much closer to this fight than we are, worried about the thousands of foreign fighters that are flowing in and out rather easily, and with no end in sight to this, and with the black banners of Al-Qaeda and ISIS now drawing recruits, they're very worried, and I know American counterterrorism officials are as well.
And also within the EU, they have no restriction at all once people get inside about traveling between European countries. So once you're inside the Schengen gate, then you can travel to Germany, to France, Holland, anywhere.
I think our clock has just about run out, but I want to ask you one more question, and then I was told I could make closing remarks, and something just occurred to me, so I'm going to make them. But the question has to do with something else that's right in the headlines right now, and that's what's going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I'll just ask you a very simplistic softball question. How does that figure into our thinking when it comes to counterterrorism and threats against the United States and its allies?
Well, it certainly complicates the environment. And to date, what you've had is Israel, in some ways, being an oasis in a region caught in conflict and awash in it. What this does is it further complicates it. And in some ways, we've sort of drawn the line on our diplomacy so that there is no sort of natural cushion through the use of classic diplomacy between the Palestinians and the Israelis to sort of bring this to a close. But to your question about what about the threat to the U.S., the groups that we worry about and that the Israelis worry about as well, are animated by these fights. They don't view at times a difference between the U.S. and Israel. And so a fight against Israel in some ways is an animating principle for the fight against the West. We've not yet seen ISIS turn its sights on Israel, but certainly one of the programs, one of the strategies for al-Qaeda all along has been establishing its caliphate in the Middle East, establishing a presence in the Levant, and then moving onward to Jerusalem. This was captured in a letter from Ayman al-Zawahiri, who now runs al-Qaeda, in a letter to Zarqawi, who ran al-Qaeda in Iraq, to lay out the strategy for the region. That strategy in some ways still holds, and that's in part what ties Israeli security to American security.
I was just given a note. It says we can keep going a little longer. Is that okay with everybody out there? Okay. Who knows how many are not clapping?
Yeah, there's a whole swath of people saying, we want to get out of here.
No, I'm told that the taxi rank out front is empty right now. Iran, I don't even know if Iran has come up.
Are we doing list of horribles? Is that what we're doing?
We're doing list of horribles, yeah. This is sort of the modern Roger Ebert.
All right.
There's an old expression in the Middle East, and it goes like this: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Today, when we're talking about ISIS, the Sunni group ISIS, and Americans are beginning to learn more about this than we perhaps ever wanted to know, and Iraq, of course, is Shiite. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Iraq is supporting what's left of the government Iran is supporting what's left of the government in Iraq, which is a Shiite government. They're providing support for Mr. Assad, which is a sort of offshoot Shiite government. And so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Can you see collaboration with Iran?
One word answer? No. Longer answer? Hell no.
Now, I don't know. I can guess. I don't know if people are applauding the spirit of your answer or just the humor.
Why? I'm not known for my humor. Look, the Iranians, since '79, the Iranians have been intent on becoming a hegemonic power in the Middle East. They are intent on building a nuclear capability. They say it's to have medical isotopes. You don't build a reactor that is impervious to bombs in order to make medical isotopes. You don't build a heavy water reactor at Arak that can be used only to make bombs in order to make medical isotopes. You don't endure sanctions as long as they have in order to build medical isotopes. They're intent on building an atomic weapon, and they will do anything and everything they can. And the great lesson I think they learned in Libya was that if you give up your atomic weapons, which the Libyans did in response to pressure from us, next stop is oblivion. So the lesson they learned, I think, is a negative one from our standpoint, and I think they are intent on having a weapon. And we have a pipe dream going in Vienna. I don't think it's going to go any place that we want to go.
With respect, you can separate that issue out. It's all integrated, of course, but you could separate it out and just ask in the context of fighting in the geopolitical spirit of the lesser of two evils. And the United States has long operated on that principle. Sometimes you have to support the lesser of two evils, even if it's still evil. That Iran and the United States together might somehow collaborate successfully against these dangerous Sunni forces that are overtaking part of the Middle East.
First of all, Sunnis are the majority in the Middle East. The Saudis are Sunnis. All the Gulf states are Sunni. If you're going to bet on somebody, you bet on Sunnis. You don't bet on Shiites. You certainly don't bet on Persians, as opposed to Arabs, which is what the Iranians are. And finally, you don't bet on a power that is intent on dominating that part of the world. We don't need the Iranians to fight ISIS if we're intent on fighting ISIS.
Who have we got to fight ISIS? Iraq doesn't seem to be in good shape.
We could put 1,000 U.S. I'm not talking about boots on the ground. I'm talking about special forces that are trained in gathering intelligence to point out targets and take out a substantial part of ISIS because they are conducting themselves like an army now. They line up in convoys and travel by day. They're sitting ducks if we wanted to do it.
I think, there's a moment of creativity here because I think the judge is right. You don't have to rely on the Iranians. I was on Fox with Geraldo once, and we were talking about the Somali pirates. And his grand conclusion at the end of the session was we needed to enlist the Iranian Navy to help deal with the problem. And somewhat preposterous, in part because it wasn't a question of needing the Iranians. It was a question of applying a strategy and resources to a problem that the global community knew was there. And that's the issue here. And so do we have allies on the ground? Absolutely. There are elements of the Iraqi military that we trained, that our guys fought next to, that are still there. And that's the 300 U.S. Special Forces guys that are there are linking up with them. So they're elements of the Iraqi military. The Kurds are incredibly powerful fighters. And in fact, if you look at Mosul, the second largest city that ISIS took over, they only took over half the city. Why? Because the other half is controlled by the Kurds. And what has ISIS done? They've not crossed the river because they don't want to fight with the Kurds.
They don't want to mess with the Kurds.
They don't want to mess with the Peshmerga. So the Peshmerga are there. What about the Turkish army? The Turkish army is powerful. It's a NATO force. They actually protect Turkish sites in Syria already. Nobody touches them. So what are we doing with the Turks? The Jordanians are very good intelligence gatherers. What are we doing there? The Saudis, the Emiratis want to provide support. So where's the coalition of the willing to deal with the marauding forces of these extremist groups? What's lacking is a quarterback, the leadership, the strategy.
Would each of you like to see the United States become the quarterback?
Absolutely. And I think we could have done it long ago in Syria when things were much less complicated. And I think the Turks would have welcomed it. You talk to Turkish diplomats, you talk to the Turkish military. The question always is with these countries, where has the United States been? Where are the promises of arms? Where is the promise of political and diplomatic capital? Nobody's talking about sending in the 82nd Airborne into the territory. You don't necessarily need that. But the longer we go, the longer we wait, the more likely it is that we're the only power that's going to be able to dislodge these groups. And you asked the question earlier, how do you deal with the financing of these groups? It gets very hard to push the bank regulatory button or to toss in the Treasury paratrooper to deal with a problem like this if they control territory. What do you have to do? You have to physically dislodge these people from control of territory. That gets hard. That gets costly. And at some point, you've got to do it.
You ask who's the quarterback? We had been the quarterback since World War I, and it went fairly well. There is now no quarterback, and it's not going well.
Well, depending on the quarterback duties, one could argue that there's no taste, no inclination today in America after, what are we talking, 13 years of war, to be the quarterback.
Well, if there's no taste for being the quarterback, then we're going to have to develop a taste for a further deterioration in the direction that things have been going in the last year or so. And as little taste as there is for being the quarterback, I don't think we want to live with the consequences of that. I really don't.
I'm going to throw in something on my editorial side. I agree with you. I'm not supposed to do that. I just ask the questions here. Because it's kind of like the Mideast negotiations, Mideast on a small scale, meaning the Israelis and the Palestinians. The United States has tried to play a role in creating peace between the two sides since Richard Nixon, and every subsequent president has tried. Everyone has failed. And so Obama came in knowing, I might fail, but let's try. Bush before that said the same thing. But we have to keep skin in the game for one simple reason. If we don't, somebody else moves in. You know what they say about a vacuum. And then they shape a world maybe even worse than the one we are trying to shape. We're probably out of time now. Is that right? So those articulate, never to be forgotten closing remarks. I mean, they're not hard for me to come up with because I've said this in many speeches. I talk a lot about the Middle East particularly. Life is not a fairy tale. The world is not the setting for a fairy tale. And sometimes there's no happy ending. So I don't know. Raise your hands if you're going to sleep a little better tonight from what you've heard. Raise your hands if you might not sleep as well. But that's the reality.
Can I offer a positive note?
After my closing remarks.
I'm sorry. I'm an eternal optimist, so I can't stand that nobody raised their hands when you first asked. I do think we have the ability to shape the environment. And I think the false dichotomy of an all-or-nothing approach of our foreign policy, boots on the ground or nothing, exhaustion and absence or all in, is the wrong framework. And to the extent that that's a straw man construct strategically, that doesn't allow us to think creatively about what some of the policy solutions are. Whether it's using our financial power, which is why I wrote the book Treasury War, whether it's use of intelligence, new relationships, thinking creatively about a new Kurdish state, for example. And so there's room for the use of American power and influence if we decide to use it. And that doesn't mean just use of the military.
Judge, closing remarks from you.
I'll stand on Juan's closing remarks.
Okay, thank you to both of you. Thank you. I can't get...
I'd like to thank all three of our panelists and the moderator, of course. You know, it's as I sit here and I observe and I listen to the issues, and I know that most of you here, you're here because you're interested in what's happening in the world, and it's pretty overwhelming. But, you know, it starts someplace of awareness, and I think of the mission of the cell and where we started and where we are and what we're doing. And, you know, I always have various political leaders as they come through the country, through our exhibit, they say, "Larry, we should have one of these in every city." I just smiled and I said, "Well, wire the money." So anyway, that comes pretty quick to the end of that conversation. But it's great to see everyone here, and I encourage you to go on our website, thecell.org. Be aware of our programs. As they say, get involved, make a difference. Your friends, your neighbors. You know, the product we're selling is our country, and is our civilization and our way of life. And that way of life, there's others, and there's hundreds of millions of them that want to change it. We forget we are minorities. Our way of life, as they discussed, others see it as being heathens. You know, that what we take for granted, they consider it inappropriate. And if we want to protect those rights, then we'll have to fight for them. And whether we fight for them here or elsewhere in the world or in their air or on the ground, we do have a choice. And if you want to be part of it, you need to have yourselves and your families and our political leaders and be supportive, because the options are very narrow. As I commented earlier, General Petraeus is going to be with us on 9/11. There's limited tickets. They will be on sale electronically, those of you that know how to do that. And I encourage you to order your tickets early in order to participate in an exciting evening. And for our three distinguished honored guests, we're so thankful you're here this evening and that you've continued to bring into focus and awareness that in which is an issue so challenging and so dangerous. So thank each and every one of you, and God bless all of you, and have a nice evening.